Saturday morning, a little after 6, at the boat ramp on the north end of a reservoir most people in town have never bothered to drive out to. There's a group that shows up here every weekend, retired guys mostly. Coffee going cold in styrofoam cups, trading the same 3 jokes they've traded for years while the mist burns off the water. This morning, there's a crowd forming around the ramp, and the reason is Clyde. Clyde just backed a brand new bass boat down the concrete. Metallic flake paint, a motor big enough to be illegal on half the lakes in the state, digital everything, still stickered up from the dealership, $68,000, financed, and the guys are all over it. Somebody whistles, somebody asks what she'll do, wide open. Clyde's grinning, one hand on the console, telling them about the new place he and his wife just closed on, the one closer to the water. Off to the side, a man named Marvin is doing the same thing he does every Saturday. He's backing a dented aluminum John boat off a trailer that's older than some of the guys standing there. Same boat for years. A tackle box with a cracked latch, a green thermos with the paint worn clean off one side. Nobody's looking at Marvin. Nobody ever looks at Marvin. And as he walks past the crowd, one of the younger guys grins and says it half friendly, the way you rib somebody. "Marvin, when are you finally going to treat yourself, man? Upgrade that thing." Marvin just smiles, doesn't say a word, pushes off and putters out onto the water with his coffee. Here's what nobody standing on that ramp knows. Marvin and Clyde retired the same year from the same kind of career, decent, ordinary, middle class, the kind nobody writes articles about. They're both 66, and when they retired, they had almost exactly the same amount of money. Marvin had about $420,000. Clyde had about $420,000 too. Now let me jump you forward 6 years to a Saturday just like this one. Clyde isn't at the ramp anymore. Clyde sold the bass boat. At 72, his $420,000 is down to about $140,000, and every month it drops a little more, and he started calling his financial advisor with a knot in his stomach that doesn't go away. Marvin's still here, same John boat, same green thermos, and his $420,000, it's worth close to $490,000 now. It went up after the paycheck stopped while he was out on this water doing, as far as anyone could see, absolutely nothing. Same starting number. 6 years later, the man everybody felt a little sorry for has more than 3 times the money of the man everybody envied. So how does that happen? How does the guy in the dented aluminum boat win? It comes down to 4 lessons. Not tricks, not tactics. 4 things Marvin understood a long time ago, most of them before he ever retired. And I'll be honest with you about these 4 up front. Every single one of them looks from the outside like a flaw. Not a strategy, a flaw. Which is exactly why nobody on that ramp ever suspected a thing. And there's one more piece, but it's not a lesson. It's the gear that all 4 lessons feed into the thing that quietly turned 4 ordinary habits into nearly $500,000. It only makes sense once you've seen the other 4, so I'm holding it for the end. Stay with me, and you'll see exactly how the number climbed. Let's start with the first one. First, the thing almost nobody stops to question. There's a script we all carry into retirement, and it runs like gravity. You work, you save, you build a pile, and the day the working stops, you start spending that pile down until it's gone. The industry even has a name for that phase: decumulation. Just a polite word for draining what you saved year after year, hoping the timing holds. And the national numbers seem to back it up. Across the whole country, household net worth climbs for decades, peaks right in Marvin and Clyde's age bracket, 65 to 74, at $409,900, and then it falls. Build, summit, decline. That's the map every one of us gets handed. But there's something that map leaves out, and it's the thing that made Marvin's whole retirement possible. When he stopped working, his paycheck didn't actually drop to 0. Social Security. The typical retired worker gets a little under $2,000 a month plus a modest pension. Together came to about $4,200 a month, landing whether the market was up, down, or on fire. His normal spending was around $6,000 a month. So that floor already covered about 70% of his life guaranteed for as long as he lived. Here's the part that matters. That floor meant Marvin didn't have to sell his investments to live. He could leave them alone. And here's the catch this whole video turns on. Clyde had the exact same floor, same Social Security, same kind of pension. Roughly 70% of his life was covered too. same starting money, same guaranteed floor. So the floor isn't what separated these two men. 4 lessons did. Let me show you the first. Lesson 1. Marvin never spent money to be seen, and he learned it young, decades before retirement, which is the only reason it was already automatic by the time it mattered most. Think about where most overspending actually comes from. Not recklessness, not stupidity, comparison. The coworker's new truck, the neighbor's remodeled kitchen, the silent scoreboard running in every workplace and every driveway in America. Marvin figured out early that the scoreboard was rigged, that no purchase ever made to impress people actually buys their respect. It buys their attention for about a week, and then they go right back to thinking about themselves. So he opted out. Not dramatically, he just quietly stopped playing. The same modest house for decades. The truck he drove until it was paid off, and then kept driving. The John boat, and when he retired, that lifelong habit paid a bonus he never even planned for. The day he left work, the scoreboard he'd been ignoring for years went silent for everyone else too. Nobody at the reservoir cared what his truck cost. His spending, already low, drifted lower not through some heroic budget, but because the last few reasons to spend had left the room. And here's what he'd known for 30 years. He didn't feel deprived. You can't miss applause you never wanted. Now Clyde. Clyde spent his whole life on the scoreboard, and he retired straight on to a bigger one. The new place by the lake. The $68,000 bass boat. The upgrades. I earned this. And he had earned it. That's what makes it so tragic. But every upgrade set a new baseline, and baselines never move backward. So Clyde's spending didn't fall when he retired. It climbed. On top of the $5,000 a month he was already pulling out of his investments to pay for all of it. Put a number on the habit itself. The average American household spends somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000 a year on things bought mainly to be seen cars nicer than needed, upgrades triggered by what the neighbors did. Over the decades, Marvin was working and quietly not paying that tax. That alone was tens of thousands of dollars that went into his investments instead of into other people's opinions of him. Here's the rule. What looks like cheapness is usually just someone who stopped paying for an audience that was never really watching. Marvin looked cheap. He was free. But spending was the easy one. The next lesson is the one that cost people the most, and it only shows up on the worst day. Lesson 2. When everyone around him panicked, Marvin did nothing. And I mean that as the highest compliment there is in investing. He learned this one young too through a couple of downturns in his working years, watching the people around him make the same mistake every single time. So when the big one finally came, he was ready by being unready, by having already decided years earlier that he simply wouldn't move. Here's the test. 2 years into retirement, the market crashed. The kind of drop that leads the evening news 3 nights running, red numbers with a frightening size to them. On paper, both men's accounts fell in the same week by roughly the same amount. Same storm, 2 very different men standing in it. Clyde did what fear tells you to do. He'd been watching the number on a screen every single day that had become his retirement, refreshing the account so when it started to bleed, he felt every drop. He lasted about 2 weeks, read 4 articles asking if this was the big one, and on a Tuesday morning he logged in and sold everything, moved to cash, waited for it to feel safe. Think about what that cost him. By the time it felt safe, the market had already climbed back 15, maybe 20% past the point where he'd bailed. He didn't just take the loss. He made it permanent and then paid a premium to climb back onto the train he'd jumped off. There's decades of research on exactly this. The average investor captures only a fraction of what the market itself returns, and nearly the whole gap is behavior. Selling scared, buying back late. Clyde was that gap in the flesh. Marvin didn't sell. He didn't even really look. Because his floor was covering his life, he didn't have to touch a single share to eat, which meant he could afford to do the hardest thing in all of investing, which is nothing at all. He let the crash be temporary. He filled the green thermos and went fishing. The crash recovered the way they almost always do given enough time, and because Marvin was still fully invested when it did, he caught the entire rebound. Clyde caught none of it. Same crash, opposite outcomes, and the only variable that mattered was whether the man could sit still. Here's the rule, and it's the one I'd tattoo on the inside of my eyelids if I could. The advantage was never timing the market. It was building a life stable enough that he never had to. Marvin's calm wasn't willpower. It was structure and a lesson he'd been rehearsing for 30 years. What looked like a man asleep at the wheel was the most disciplined move on the whole lake. And if you're starting to see yourself in one of these two men, hold that thought, because the next lesson is the one most people get wrong without ever noticing they're doing it. Lesson 3. Marvin left good things alone. This is the quietest lesson of the 4, and the one that looks the most like laziness, because while Clyde was managing, Marvin was, on paper, doing nothing at all. Let me show you the difference in a single image. Clyde checked his portfolio most days. He had the app. He moved money around when something spooked him or excited him. He chased a hot fund a buddy mentioned, a newsletter, a better allocation he read about, a can't-miss idea at a dinner party. Every move felt like progress, felt smart, felt like a man taking his retirement seriously. Marvin checked his maybe twice a year. He'd set up a boring, balanced mix of low-cost funds a long time ago, pointed his automatic contributions at it through all his working years, and then in the phrase that drove his own wife a little crazy, sometimes he just let it sit. Here's what almost nobody understands. Every time Clyde chased something new, he reset the clock. He'd sell what he had, buy the new thing, pay the spread, sometimes trigger a tax, and start the compounding over from zero on that money. He did it again and again. 4 or 5 major strategy changes across the years. Each one felt like activity. Each one quietly restarted the math. Marvin never reset. Not once. The same funds, the same automatic decision, running untouched for decades. And that's the part that sounds boring when you say it out loud, and it's supposed to, because the excitement of a new move is almost always the sound of a compounding curve being wiped back to the start. There's data on this that should be printed on every brokerage account. The more people trade, the worse they tend to do. Study after study finds the most active investors underperform the ones who barely touch anything after fees, after taxes, after all that motion. Activity feels like control. It usually costs you. Clyde mistook motion for progress. He was busy, engaged, informed, and wrong. Marvin looked like he'd forgotten he even had a portfolio, and that forgetting is precisely what let it grow. Here's the rule. What looks like laziness is often just refusing to interrupt the one thing that's already working. Marvin wasn't neglecting his money. He was protecting it from the most dangerous person in the room, himself. But even leaving it alone wasn't the whole story, because underneath all of this was a way of thinking about time that Clyde never had. That's lesson 4. Lesson 4. Marvin thought in decades. Clyde thought in years, and then, near the end, in months. This one sounds almost philosophical, but it changed the math more than any of the others. For most of his life, Marvin's money had a deadline. Get me to retirement, then get me through it. But somewhere along the way, and definitely by the time he actually retired, he stopped seeing the money as his to use up. He started seeing it as something that would outlast him. Money for his kids, his grandkids, the family down the line. And that one shift in framing did something concrete. It stretched his time horizon from maybe 20 years to something closer to 40 or 50. Nothing on the statement changed. The dollars didn't know how old he was. He just handed them a much longer runway, and a longer runway changes everything about how money behaves, because it gives compounding the room to do its work. Clyde's horizon ran the other way. It got shorter every year. At 66, he was thinking about the next decade. By 70, he was thinking about the next year. By 72, watching the balance drop, he was thinking about the next few months. How long can this possibly last? And a short horizon makes people do short horizon things. Sell in the panic, spend out of fear, grab at the money instead of letting it grow. His shrinking timeline wasn't just a feeling. It became the behavior that drained the account. Here's the strange part. Marvin, thinking of the money as not really his, spent less of it and grabbed at it less, and so he kept more of it. Clyde, thinking of it as his and running out, clutched at it constantly, and so it slipped through his fingers faster. The rule: the tightest grip loses the most. The open hand keeps more. What looked like Marvin ignoring reality planning for a future past his own lifetime was the longest, clearest view on the water. So those are the 4. He never spent to be seen. When everyone panicked, he did nothing. He left good things alone. He thought in decades. 4 lessons, every one of them looking like a flaw from the outside. But knowing the 4 doesn't explain the number. It doesn't explain how 4 ordinary habits turned $420,000 into nearly $490,000, while another man with the identical start dropped to $140,000. For that, you need the gear the 4 lessons feed into. The one I told you I was holding, here it is. Here's the thing. Every one of those 4 lessons was quietly protecting. It's called the compounding tale, and once you see it, the whole story snaps into focus. Compounding does most of its work at the very end, not the beginning. The first years feel like almost nothing. A little growth on a little pile, but every year the base gets bigger, so the next year's growth is bigger, and the year after that bigger still, and late in the game the curve doesn't rise, it lunges. On a base of $400,000, a single ordinary year can quietly add $20,000, even $30,000. That's more than some of the raises Marvin waited years to get. Arriving in a year, he lifted a finger for none of it. The biggest dollar growth of an entire investing life almost always lands in the final stretch. Now hold that against the national map I gave you earlier, the one where net worth peaks at $409,900 and then falls. Look closer at that peak and something shows up that almost nobody notices. For the households that make it into the 70 to 74 range and keep their money invested, the median doesn't fall. It climbs to $438,700. The number goes up inside retirement in the exact years everyone assumes it goes down. That climb is the sound of the compounding tale, and it belongs to the people who stayed in for it. That's the gear. And now every lesson pays off at once. Marvin never spent to be seen, so there was a full pile left to compound. He did nothing in the crash, so the pile was still whole and invested when the tale arrived. He left it alone, so the clock never reset and the curve never restarted. He thought in decades, so he gave the tale the runway it needed to lunge. 4 lessons, all feeding one gear. And that gear is the whole reason the passive man in the dented aluminum boat ended up with more than 3 times the money of the man who did everything that looked smart. Clyde had the same shot at that tale. The identical starting money, the identical floor, but he spent, he panicked, he tinkered, and he thought in shrinking years, and every one of those things quit the race before the tail ever showed up. He walked out of the marathon at mile 24. Marvin ran through the tape. He didn't get lucky. He got out of the way, and he stayed out of the way long enough for the math to finish. Here's what only becomes visible when you lay all 4 lessons down side by side. He never spent to impress. That sounds cheap. He did nothing when the market crashed. That sounds asleep at the wheel. He left his money untouched for decades. That sounds lazy. He planned past his own lifetime. That sounds like a man ignoring the clock. From the outside, every one of the 4 looks like a flaw. Something Marvin got wrong or failed to do. From the balance sheet, from the account that climbed toward $490,000 while Clyde's fell to $140,000, every single one is the reason he won. That's the whole paradox, and it's exactly why men like Marvin stay invisible. The moment you explain what they're doing, it doesn't sound like a strategy. It sounds like the absence of one. And that's precisely what it is. Marvin didn't get richer by doing something clever. He got richer by refusing to do the 4 things that feel smart and quietly destroy wealth, and then leaving the rest completely alone, while an entire boat ramp full of people felt sorry for him. He didn't get lucky. He got out of the way. Now I have to be straight with you, because this is where it stops being Marvin's story and starts being yours. Whose last few years look more like the road you're on, Marvin's or Clyde's? The honest caveat first. If your Social Security and any pension don't come close to covering your basic bills, then you may genuinely need to draw on your portfolio early, and the leave it alone move isn't fully available to you the same way. Same if you're carrying heavy debt into retirement or facing large medical costs. For you, the math is different, and forcing this model could do real harm. I won't pretend otherwise. But here's the uncomfortable version for everyone else. If your floor already covers most of your month and you're still checking the account every day, still selling a little every time the news gets loud, still spending to prove to somebody that you haven't slipped, still thinking in shrinking years, then you're closer to Clyde than you'd like to admit. And it isn't because you didn't earn enough, it's because nobody ever told you the pile was allowed to keep growing after the paychecks stopped. If you're seeing yourself in one of these 2 men, do me a favor and subscribe. This whole channel is about how to be the one in the aluminum boat. So let me tell you what I think this is really about, underneath all the numbers. We're taught that retirement is the finish line, the day you stop building and start spending down what you built. And that one story, quietly, is what cost people the richest years their money was ever going to have. Because the truth Marvin understood a long time ago is almost the opposite. His wealth didn't grow because he did more than Clyde. It grew because he did less. He stopped spending to impress. He stopped selling out of fear. He stopped tinkering with what was working. He stopped grabbing at money that was already growing for him. The getting richer was never an action. It was the patience to leave 4 good things alone and let a 5th do its work. Marvin would laugh at being called disciplined. He'd tell you he just figured out young that the quiet way was the free way, and that when you stop being scared of your own money, it grows into the space the fear used to take up. Meanwhile, Clyde is still calling his advisor, still managing, still working harder at his money than Marvin ever did, with 1/3 of what Marvin has. The wealthiest years of Marvin's life came after he stopped trying to get wealthier. That's the part nobody tells you. The paycheck stopping wasn't the end of his growing. It was the beginning of it. If this changed how you see your own retirement even a little, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this reach other people staring down the same fear Clyde never could sit still with. Then tell me in the comments, what's the one thing about the first year of retirement that scares you most? Be specific. I read these and I answer every one I can. I'll see you in the next one.